Some people say neurotypicals don't exist.
How do you neurotypicals even function?
They don't function the way you imagine, mainly because neurotypical people don't actually exist.
I agree and disagree, because if everybody was like us, if everybody truly was a little bit autistic, I think we'd be bullied a lot less. But who is the most neurotypical of them all? Mirror, mirror on the wall. What is the most normal brain? Who has it? It starts to feel a bit uncomfortable quite quickly thinking like that. And then to add to that, so many people are diagnosed with conditions later in life. Half of all autistic adults in the UK might be undiagnosed. So a lot of neurotypicals might not be that neurotypically after all. The neurotypical partner of ADHD_love over on TikTok, Rich, is now thinking that he might be autistic and looking into pursuing a diagnosis. Is anyone even neurotypical anymore? She screams into the void. Where have the neurotypicals gone? Did they even exist in the first place? It's obviously tricky to define neurotypical. It isn't a diagnostic label, it's the absence of one.
Neurotypical simply really means a person without those specific traits in their brains that we identify as neurodivergency. That does not actually mean that they are all the same. There is still a lot of variability. There is not a typical neurotypical.
If you didn't know, if you don't know what the hell I'm talking about, neurotypical is short for neurologically typical. I think it's a useful term and much better than saying normal. The opposite of neurotypical is, of course, neurodivergent. So diverging, different from the typical. Sometimes people just mean autistic and or ADHDers when they use this term, but it can also include other neurodevelopmental conditions such as dyslexia and dyspraxia, which affects your coordination. It can include intellectual disabilities, it can include OCD and Tourette's, and it can sometimes be extended to include mental health conditions as well. It is, of course, important to remember that everybody is different, regardless of whether you slot into a particular diagnostic category. There is sometimes a bit of an attitude, and some of it is joking, but sometimes, particularly with autistic people, there's this idea that, all neurotypical people are sheep. They have no interests, they're all the same, they're all NPCs. Obviously, that isn't true. I have a lot of neurotypical people in my life. I'm married to one. I also have quite a few family members who are neurodivergent, but not autistic. And I've been thinking a lot over the last few years about what neurotypical actually means and where we draw that line. It doesn't have a diagnostic criteria, but if it did, what would be on it? So here is my list of 10 or maybe 9.5 traits of neurotypicalism. Remember, I am just one autistic person, not a medical professional. I cannot diagnose you as anything, not even neurotypical. And this video is not meant to invalidate any neurodivergent people either, or convince you that you're actually neurotypical or anything like that. Remember that we've all lived different lives with different expectations on us. Many of us have learned to mask our traits in order to fit in better, so we may appear neurotypical to somebody looking on the outside. That's why we say saying that somebody looks autistic or doesn't look autistic is silly. Have you seen their brain? I hope you haven't. So here we go. Signs you are part of the 80-ish% maybe of people who are classed as neurologically typical. Number 1, you may be neurotypical if you are able to regulate your emotions well. You don't find yourself having mood swings or behaving impulsively. You don't find yourself having big reactions, whether those are internal or externalized in some way, to things that other people might say, or just small annoyances or inconveniences, or things that other people might not even notice at all. Lots of neurodivergent people experience emotional dysregulation for a variety of reasons. For example, ADHDers in particular sometimes experience something called rejection-sensitive dysphoria, which is intense emotional pain when confronted with rejection or perceived rejection. For example, I remember my ADHD friend storming off because she thought that I was ignoring her, but I was actually just so focused in on writing an essay that I hadn't even realized she was there. The reaction seemed, over the top. It really confused me at the time and kind of upset me. But now that I know more about ADHD, I completely understand why she felt so hurt, and I wish I'd understood that at the time. None of this is to say that, every neurodivergent person is completely emotionally unstable or anything like that. People can learn coping skills as they grow up. They might take medications. They might go to therapy to cope with these responses. And it's important to note that sometimes these responses, while they might be confusing to the people around the neurodivergent person, they may be completely valid because everybody has a different experience of the world. If that neurodivergent person person is experiencing physical pain as a result of a sensory sensitivity, then is it really an emotional overreaction? Also, it's important to note that, of course, everybody, even the neurotypicals out there, will experience negative emotions sometimes. There are many, many times in this life where, most people would struggle to keep it together. When you're grieving, as an example, when you're tired as well, I think it's hard for anybody to regulate their emotions properly. When they just got off a long haul flight, everyone can be a bit of a grump and a bit more prone to mood swings. But even in those cases, a neurodivergent person may be more affected, by something like lack of sleep, and they may have a bigger response, whether that's internalized or externalized. My end of school exams, which you might see as like a pretty typical stressor, like everyone gets stressed about exams, they triggered like a complete mental breakdown for me as an autistic person, and I ultimately had to drop out of education when I was 17, despite doing well academically. But my neurotypical husband, I don't understand him. He's just so emotionally level. I didn't know it was possible to just be so okay all of the time until I met him, just day after day, month after month. I don't know, maybe he's just like some other kind of extreme among neurotypicals. But he also says until he met me and also met some of my friends, he said he didn't really realize that some people really genuinely do struggle with their mental health on a day-to-day basis, even when there's no obvious reason to be sad or cripplingly anxious. And I thought everybody was going home and having autistic meltdowns after a long day, If you'd like to know more about autistic meltdowns, you want to learn more about them, see if that's something that resonates with you, I will leave my video about autistic meltdowns linked on screen. In my experience with neurotypicals, as a generalization, they are more level, they are more in control of how they react when things go wrong. And even if they go through times of poor mental health and low mood, these are more transient. They can become well and back to their neurotypical selves again after some time or some intervention. A neurodivergent person will always be a neurodivergent person, and things like emotional regulation may always be a little bit more of a battle. Before we move on to the next point, misinformation about autism and ADHD in the media is becoming more of an issue. I'm also starting to notice neurodivergence being weaponized politically, which is worrying. I discussed that in more detail in this video, particularly towards the end. I really worry about how social media algorithms are contributing to the current nonsense. It feels a bit like the internet has been funneled into these two teams that are constantly screaming at each other, and unfortunately conspiracy theories and far-right rhetoric has been able to flourish. I don't know what we do to fix all of that. It's very scary, but I think the sponsor of today's video, Ground News, is a positive step in the right direction. Ground News is an app and website that aggregates news from 50,000 sources, allowing you to compare how different outlets are covering the same story. For each headline, they provide additional information like the bias, who owns the source. I had no idea that the Walt Disney Company owns Vice. And Ground News allocates a factuality rating, which makes it easier to weed out less trustworthy sources. Recently, a bunch of headlines were published about a study that estimated 15 million adults in the US have ADHD. We can browse 44 articles about this on Ground News. We can see that only 24% of the coverage of this story is from the right. Fox News is the farthest right on the bias distribution chart, and their factuality is rated mixed, so we know to be cautious and be ready to fact check. And indeed, in this article, they talk to a psychotherapist and performance coach, not a psychiatrist. He is generally quite negative about ADHD meds and thinks that people should lessen their reliance on medication. However, as a psychotherapist, he does not have the medical training required to prescribe ADHD medication. By comparison, on the left, we have a piece from Philly Voice. This one is deemed very high factuality, and they state that medication is the most common and effective way to treat ADHD, and that more people are aware of the fact that they may have ADHD due to information shared on social media, rather than implying that scrolling on social media gives you ADHD, which is unfortunately what they do in the Fox News article. I also really appreciate the Ground News blind spot feed, where I can discover stories that have had very little to no coverage on either the left or the right. You can check out Ground News at ground.news/nowwhat, or you can use the QR code on screen. If you sign up through my link now, you'll get a whole 50% off their Vantage plan. At the moment, they're having their biggest sale of the year, so this is a great time to check them out if you've been considering it. I really love being aware of all angles, and I think Ground News is a great tool to encourage media literacy and independent thinking. After the last few weeks, I'm not sure we've ever needed Ground News more than we do right now. Number 2, you may be considered neurotypical if you've never really had a mental health issue in the past, if you generally consider yourself quite mentally well. Another symptom of poor emotional regulation is struggling with low mood and getting stuck in negative emotions or experiencing something called anhedonia, which basically means you stop enjoying things. You have have an inability to experience pleasure. It's associated with many different types of neurodivergence. I personally noticed that I go quite numb to joy when I'm in a period of autistic burnout. It's like your hobbies and all the things you love just don't work anymore. There is a link between being autistic and having something called social anhedonia too, so lack of joy from social experiences. I think that makes sense, not because we hate other people or anything like that, but just because social experiences can be so draining for autistic people. A lot of the people who are diagnosed with autism and or ADHD later in life are initially diagnosed or sometimes misdiagnosed with a mental health condition. Before I was diagnosed autistic, I was previously quite a number of times given medication for anxiety and depression. It is important to remember that in general, a lot of people will struggle with their mental health. In the UK, 1 in 6 people report struggling with common symptoms of poor mental health, such as anxiety. But if you compare that with autistic people, 94% of us experience anxiety. And 6 in 10 autistic people say this anxiety affects their ability to get on with their life, which, yeah, me experiencing panic attacks in my exams unfortunately did affect my ability to get on with my life. Sadly, the stats for depression in autistic people are also super high. So if you've never felt the need to access mental health services, you may be more likely to be neurotypical, or you may have just spent your life suffering in silence and internalizing all of your problems. Apparently 61% of adults with mental health difficulties will not access treatment. If you're just super used to internalizing everything, if you were brought up to internalize everything, it can be super hard to tell if what you're experiencing on a day-to-day basis is typical. You can't compare to anyone else's mental state, you can't step inside someone else's brain for the day. I didn't think I was an anxious person for most of my life. I really resented the idea that I might have an anxiety problem because I wished that I wasn't an anxious person. Number 3, this is a big one. Good executive functioning skills could be a clue that you are neurotypical. So our executive functioning describes a bunch of different mental processes that enable us to plan, to control our impulses, focus our attention, problem solve, adapt to new situations, remember instructions, and juggle multiple tasks simultaneously. Struggling with executive functioning is linked to a whole load of different conditions that can affect your brain functioning. People who are diagnosed autistic and ADHD, but also people with OCD, to dementia as well. Interestingly, it can also be caused by B12 deficiency, thyroid issues, and certain medications as well. So I don't know if these symptoms came on suddenly, it might be something you'd want to talk to your doctor about. If you struggle with your executive functioning, you may notice that you're time blind, so you can't accurately assess how much time has passed or predict how long a task is going to take you to complete. My neurotypical husband is amazing at estimating how long something is going to take. It's like a superpower. It's really impressive. Whereas my mom, who's pretty sure she's dyslexic, she's a woman in her 50s, so it's not surprising that she wasn't diagnosed. Both of us act like we can mold time to our every whim, despite all of the evidence that that is not true, and just continue to not acknowledge reality. I've even had thoughts like, oh, I'll just watch this 30-minute video quickly. It's a 30-minute video. It's gonna take you 30 minutes, Meg. Like, I know you can watch things on double speed, but this was not an option in those cases. And I was just like, I'll just maybe take 5 minutes to watch this 30-minute video. Like, what are you talking about? That is not logical. And I don't feel like in general, in other areas of life, I'm not a logical person. This is just one particular area that I really struggle with. There are some hilarious TikToks on the ADHD_love channel about how if you tell an ADHDer that they have 300 seconds until they have to leave, they may actually panic and get ready super fast. But on the other hand, if you say 5 minutes, they might start having a shower.
Babe, we got to go in 300 seconds.
Are you being serious? Oh my god. I'm ready, I'm ready, I'm ready, I'm ready, I'm ready, I'm ready, I'm ready.
Why does that work?
Why does what work?
Well, if I'd have said 5 minutes, you'd have wanted to scroll on your phone and then probably have a shower.
Yeah, but it wasn't 5 minutes, it was 300 seconds.
Right.
My husband can't understand why this would work. He thinks 300 seconds actually sounds longer than 5 minutes. You'll have to let me know what you think. I think the 300-second thing would work on me. I don't know, something about the word seconds. It's like, oh, that sounds intense, I do think I'm getting a bit better. I'm learning from my husband. He says everything takes longer than you think it will. And there's always, unexpected distractions and interruptions. You've got to add on about an extra half an hour to a lot of tasks just as a buffer. I'm learning. People with executive executive dysfunction may find it difficult to get started with tasks as well. Autistic people talk about having something called autistic inertia, which I spoke about in this video here. Basically, a struggle with getting started, also with stopping, just this tendency that autistic people have to want to keep doing whatever they're currently doing. Some neurodivergent people may struggle with working memory, which is your ability to temporarily store and process information. I always think of it as your ability to hold information in your brain while you do stuff with that information. Neurotypical people tend to be better with this, so they may be better at remembering verbal instructions or with making decisions as well. For me, even simple decisions like picking out my son's outfit for the day can increase my heart rate a little bit. I think maybe sometimes we struggle to keep track of the options, so maybe there's extra mental processing going into that. Non-neurotypical people may also struggle with their cognitive inhibition. This isn't always the same as your behavioral inhibition. Your cognitive inhibition is more like your ability to block out information and stimuli and to just fully focus on the task at hand. So all of this means neurotypical people may, as a huge generalization because everybody is different, but they may be better at planning a particular task and getting it done on time with less distraction, particularly when this comes to boring, non-preferred tasks like housework. That can be super difficult, particularly for ADHDers and autistic people. I do want to say that your executive functioning has nothing to do with your intelligence, even though people can make you feel stupid if you're chronically late for things or forgetting instructions and having to check over them several times while doing a task. Not that we should be making people feel bad for their intelligence level anyway. It's also important to note that, of course, neurodivergent people can learn skills to cope with this. As an autistic ADHDer, I've always felt like a pretty organized person, but in a super chaotic sort of way. Some of my coping mechanisms personally weren't and aren't ideal. For example, I punish myself for being somewhat inefficient sometimes by basically never allowing myself to stop working. I also repeatedly go over all of the tasks I need to do in my head on a loop. If I go in the shower, that is literally all I will think about. I just stand there and like mutter to myself about what I have to do so I can keep track of everything. Some neurotypical people will of course just be, more disorganized than others though, and it may also depend on how you were socialized. Like for men, for example, maybe they just haven't felt as much pressure to be organized, to remember things like, people's birthdays and anniversaries. It's not so much of a social expectation, so maybe they just don't feel as much pressure to learn and work on those skills. Number 4, you might be neurotypical if you don't have what is sometimes referred to as a spiky profile. If you have more of a flat, well-rounded cognitive profile. Spiky profile basically describes how neurodivergent people tend to have more extreme strengths and weaknesses than a neurotypical person. Neurotypical people tend, as I say, to have a flatter profile. Again, this doesn't mean that, all neurotypical people are flat, boring NPCs. And it also doesn't mean that neurotypical people will never have problems and they'll never need help. But before I was diagnosed, my neurotypical husband would sometimes become a bit frustrated by some of my struggles, particularly my struggles around coordination. I have a dyspraxia diagnosis as well. And my neurotypical husband is a really, calm and patient and kind person. But even for him, it was a bit confusing. I really struggle with things like opening jars, with unlocking my own front door, with like pushing and pulling things with enough force. I have never successfully pulled a cracker. But before I was diagnosed as autistic and then also diagnosed with dyspraxia, he thought I was kind of doing those things on purpose or, just not trying hard enough. And I got the same attitude in PE. Other children would shout at me for not trying, and sometimes even teachers would shout at me for not trying. I actually got a lunchtime detention once in high school. I was such a goody two-shoes at school, and I got a lunchtime detention from a PE teacher for not putting in any effort. Because even when I put in my maximum effort, because, my movement skills are just not great, it looks like I'm not trying at all. And eventually with PE, I did just stop trying because it didn't make a difference whether I tried or not. People still screamed at me for not trying. So I was like, well, it's less painful if I just don't try than if I try my best and I'm still getting the same criticism. But I think it did look deliberate on the outside because people didn't expect me to be that bad at it because I have skills in other areas, because I'm capable in other areas. It didn't make sense to people. And I think the spiky profile, these extreme strengths and weaknesses, they can lead to autistic people both being underestimated sometimes and also overestimated, or assuming their challenges are a choice. An autistic person could be a leading expert on nuclear physics, but unable to remember to brush their teeth or clean their clothes. So I'd say in general, my neurotypical husband's skill set is more well-rounded than mine. A neurotypical is thus someone whose cognitive scores fall within 1 or 2 standard deviations of each other, forming a relatively flat profile. There is a theory that having these specialist thinking skills that neurodivergent people often have may have been useful from an evolutionary perspective to balance out this more generalist neurotypical profile. And people with dyslexia are most known for, having challenges with reading and following directions and things like that, but having dyslexia is linked to being creative and having a slightly more explorative mind, and again, may have been an evolutionary advantage. I'm obviously not trying to say that either broad category, neurotypical or neurodivergent, is superior to the other. It doesn't really matter. We're here on the spinning rock together. Either way, I do think though, logically, it just does make sense that neurodiversity, having different brains, people having different skill sets, is a positive thing. Accepting that there are some things that maybe just don't come naturally to you, and not blaming yourself so much and giving yourself some more grace in those areas can be a great thing. And the same goes for embracing your strengths. Number 5, you may be neurotypical if you don't feel like your sensory experience holds you back and gets in the way of meeting your goals and just living a happy, non-exhausted life. Of course, absolutely everybody has sensory likes and dislikes. You might have certain foods that give you the ick. I feel like most people have at least 1 or 2 foods that they absolutely hate. For my neurotypical husband, this is crisps, and he cannot stand anybody having like crisp crumbs, anything like that. It's almost a phobia at this point. I just think there are some sensory experiences that are less human friendly in general. Screaming children at a birthday party is one that comes to mind. And the saying nails on a chalkboard exists for a reason. On the other hand, if you do have sensory sensitivities, you might just not realize that you do. Again, it's similar to what I was saying with your mental state. How do you compare your sensory experience with somebody else's? You don't get to see what it's like to be in someone else's head, to see how bright they find things or how things smell from their perspective. If little background sounds have always been super loud to you and have always got under your skin and given you negative sensations, or if, say, going to the hairdressers and getting your hair washed feels really, really painful for you and not a relaxing experience, again, that is just your normal. You may feel to some extent that it is your fault that these things bother you and you just need to handle it and handle yourself better, and then internalize everything. And then by the time you're an adult, these things just feel so normal to you. They're just part of your everyday. For me, it took hearing a lot of autistic people and ADHDers talking about their sensory experiences to sort of unpack that mindset, and also chatting with my neurotypical and non-autistic family members, kind of comparing notes about our sensory experiences, like, oh, does the sky look super bright to you right now? Is the reflection of that car hurting your eyes? And they'd be like, no, what are you talking about? There are just, questions that you'd never think to ask because you assume everybody is experiencing the world, or at least I did, in the same way that you are. I think the best way to find out if you do have a neurodivergent sensory profile is to read a load of autistic and ADHD lived experiences, see if any of it resonates, and just chat to the people around you. Compare notes, as I said. It still blows me away how seen I feel when I read autistic people describing their sensory experiences. I'm currently reading this book, Unbroken by Alexis Quinn. It's not been a light read at all, but I'd absolutely recommend it and recommend supporting Alexis, so I will leave a link to it in the description below if you'd like to grab a copy. But I was just amazed by the description of going to the supermarket in this book. The strips of lights that run down the aisles were so bright, as if I was on a runway. When I looked at the shelves, patterns and numbers jumped out at me in 3D. It was like the numbers were removed from the packaging. The way things moved was blurry, as though they were going fast. Certain things popped out, like when I looked at a trolley, I would see all the squares in the metal. I realized it was impossible for me to do the shopping for the community. I completely relate to this almost visual hallucination where when things are too bright and white, things can kind of feel as if they're moving or popping out. I definitely experienced that. I found it really hard to process the squares in my maths book at school, and it would often make me feel a bit sick. Any sort of black and white pattern with lines, my eyes just kind of freak out, and the neurotypical people in my life say that doesn't happen for them. But of course, even for people who do have sensory differences, there will be huge variation. But in general, it seems like neurotypical people are able to filter their sensory experiences a little better and also not have meltdowns or experience sensory overwhelm in the way autistic people specifically often do. But again, there is no one set neurotypical sensory experience. It's like, how do we know that we're seeing the same color blue as everyone else? I really love this quote. Some difference is inevitable. We use common words and use them to refer to shared experiences, but nobody can see the same sunset, merely because perception is a property of the person, not of the sunset. Number 6, you might be neurotypical if you have never felt like an alien or wondered if you are human. And if you've never been told by the people around you that you're weird or a freak or kind of like given the side eye, although that might just be because you're surrounded by neurodivergent people, or maybe you've just got super nice, non-judgmental neurotypical people around you, or maybe both. There's actually an old autism forum called wrongplanet.net. I personally never felt like I was an alien, I don't think specifically, but I think most neurodivergent people, we grow up with this sense of knowing that we're different, but not understanding why. I guess maybe some of it comes from watching other people succeed at things that we really struggle with and wondering when they got the secret training. I think to some extent everybody, even the neurotypicals, you know, everybody wants to belong, to fit in, wonders if they're enough. But I think even when you can't put words to why you're different, even when you're not diagnosed, you can tell, you know. You can tell from the reactions of other people. There are sadly a number of studies that suggest both ADHDers and autistic people tend to not make very good first impressions, even as children, and children can be super harsh. People tend to let others who make them feel respected and comfortable into their social circles. They want to be around people that make them feel good, and they don't want to be around people that make them feel uneasy. But what if the reason for the not so comfortable exchange was due to a neurology that translates information in a different way? What if the person being interacted with has a brain that processes external and internal stimuli in a way that makes it difficult to follow common rules of social engagement? What if they are a non-speaker, not using verbal speech to express themselves and to interact? Reassuringly, some studies do seem to suggest that disclosing a diagnosis can help with this. Although unfortunately, this one particular study suggests that mislabeling an autistic person with schizophrenia actually leads to even worse first impressions. So we obviously have a way to go with destigmatizing a whole load of forms of neurodivergence. And it seems like the more knowledge people have on your condition, the more disclosing your diagnosis helps. But anyway, if the rumors from the neurotypicals are true, I don't think they tend to feel so othered and are perhaps not so afraid of this risk of not being liked. Number 7, you may be neurotypical if making friends and maintaining friendships is relatively easy for you. Again, if you are neurotypical, you're probably less likely to experience the whole, for some reason, people make very quick judgments and sometimes decide they don't like you thing, which probably does help quite a lot when it comes to making friends. Of course, introverts do exist though, and some people don't prioritize spending time with friends as much as other things that they enjoy doing. And we've all had different social experiences and different upbringings and watched our parents socialize in different ways. Obviously, if you are neurodivergent, the extent to which your social skills are affected will depend on the type of neurodivergence that you have. But even for people with the dyspraxia diagnosis, difficulties with coordination can just lead to low self-esteem. And also children may not want to get involved in things like ball games, which can be quite a big part of socializing. It's quite common that you hear autistic people talk about being lost in their own world as a child. Parents may describe them as unreachable. When I went to nursery, I used to walk around the playground on my own. I'd just circle the perimeter of the playground. Sometimes as a young person, I just looked very kind of withdrawn and had quite a blank expression. It maybe sometimes looked like not a lot was going on the inside, but internally I had this really vivid world and I was making up little stories in my head and things like that. I think it just felt safer than trying to interact with the other children. I think this meme sums up really well how socializing can feel for some neurodivergent people. So it says what social interactions look like, and they're talking and they look relatively happy and content. But then it says what social interactions feel like, and they're playing a chess game and looking pretty stressed out with sweat dropping down their face. I think often for neurodivergent people, more work goes into it. If we're masking our traits, we put in a lot of effort to trying to look normal. So if you feel like socializing has always flowed relatively well for you, it doesn't feel like a strain, then you might be neurotypical. But remember as well that neurodivergent people can obviously learn social skills, particularly as they grow up. You may find that you have to look back to your childhood in order to identify your social struggles. And number 8, you may be neurotypical if you manage to get through education without a struggle, which is not the same as getting through education without support. Some people do conflate these two things, as Abby's mum did in this video that I reacted to. But if you're not diagnosed and if support just isn't available to you because of cost or because of where you live, then you're not going to get the support whether you need it or not. And then you may be like me, you may drop out, you may just not reach your full potential, or you may be labeled as naughty or lazy or stupid, as unfortunately many people were, particularly in the past. Now, I don't know many people of any brain who genuinely like school. I'm sure those people do exist, and maybe some people just get super lucky with their school experiences, even some neurodivergent people, I'm sure. But I feel like most neurotypical I'm close to, even my own child, they seem able to tolerate school a lot better and be content. It's like they tend to slot into the whole system with less resistance. My experience of school as a neurodivergent person was that it was extremely overwhelming and exhausting. From a sensory perspective, it was smelly, the dining hall was so loud with like clanging cutlery. The social expectations were exhausting. I was seen as very well behaved most of the time, apart from some PE teachers. I did what many autistic children do, and I'm sure this applies to other neurodivergent children as well. I would be very quiet at school, and then I would come home and have a meltdown. Some parents of autistic children describe this as a Jekyll and Hyde presentation. So they have, glowing perfect reports. Teachers even say they enjoy school, and then they go home every day and they cry and have a meltdown, or just are extremely, extremely exhausted. Obviously, if you have dyslexia, you may struggle with school more on the academic side. Again, this could also lead to low self-esteem and make you kind of not want to go into school. I just think for neurodivergent people, there can be more friction with the whole school experience. As you get older and move through school, it can become super stressful as well when you have to start thinking about your future and how you're going to slot into the adult world. There can be a lot of pressure. And then these same problems that you have in school can spill over into employment as well. I think many neurodivergent people feel like a square peg trying to fit into a round hole. Despite their wish to work, the latest official statistics show that only around 3 in 10 working age autistic disabled people are in employment, compared with around 5 in 10 for all disabled people and 8 in 10 for non-disabled people. And ADHDers also often struggle. This is a quote from somebody who was laid off due to their ADHD traits. I had a tough time grappling with the sorts of executive functioning that our world operates by, like being able to set up meetings, follow through with things, focus, and be detail-orientated, he says. His manager had pointed out these failings for months, which is why his termination was hardly shocking. Number 9, you might be neurotypical if your interests don't have the tendency to become very intense or obsessive and maybe negatively affect your health or your finances or your relationships. So some people do act like neurotypical people don't have any hobbies at all. I discussed this in my recent video about speculating about whether or not celebrities are autistic. Somebody was trying to say that Beyonce is autistic because she sings, and singing is clearly her special interest. And I feel like, as I say, everyone has strengths and weaknesses and talents. If you're really, really good at something like singing, you might just want to do that all the time. It feels good to do stuff that we're good at, and I think that's true for anybody. I don't want to speculate about Beyonce's neurotype either way because I don't know. Of course, there is the whole spiky profile thing that I spoke about earlier, and because autistic people and ADHDers can have this tendency to hyper-focus and do things super intensely, we can get super, super good at stuff. And there are neurotypical people who maybe just enjoy watching TV and socializing every now and then and kind of pottering around the house, but also a lot of people of all neurotypes love reading and love gardening and love playing musical instruments, things that can also be special interests. I think likely a lot of young people of any neurotype can get super stuck on social media or really get into playing video games. Not all of these people will be neurodivergent. Some of them will be, but not all of them will be. But autistic people and ADHDers in particular can get into this hyper-focused state, like being all consumed by a super deep flow state. The rest of the world falls away. It's like you don't see anything else around you. It's a really lovely state. I like to spend as much of my life as possible in that that state, but there can also be negative consequences to that. You might forget to eat, to go to the toilet, to have enough to drink, to text your family back. I remember being so confused as a young person by certain friends or family members that I had by the fact that they didn't spend as much time on the computer as me. I was always waiting for my younger sister. I was like, oh, very soon she's gonna get to that stage where you get really fixated with being on the computer and you want to be on the computer all the time from the moment you get home to the moment you go to bed. I was always confused by the fact that, a lot of people around me liked to play out with people and didn't want to spend all their time on Neopets. ADHDers often talk about having very intense short-term interests, and I've heard quite a few people talk about how they'll sometimes overspend on these interests, and some hobbies can be super expensive, things something like photography, and maybe sometimes they'll buy all of the equipment they need to do this thing, be super into it for 2 weeks, and then just abandon it, and they have all of this stuff. So there can sometimes be financial implications to this as well. So what I'm saying is, if you feel like you're able to engage in your interests, in the things that you love doing within moderation, and pull yourself away when you need to be an adult without feeling like it's incredibly painful, you may be a neurotypical, or you may just have more discipline than I do. I don't know. And number 10, finally, as a bonus one, you may be neurotypical if your periods don't have a pretty massive impact on your mood, if you have periods, that is. Again, this depends on a lot of things. Some people have physical health conditions that can make their periods a really horrible experience. About 1 in 10 AFAB individuals have endometriosis. I do, unfortunately. Interestingly, as an aside, it does seem like it could be more common in autistic people. However, for particularly autistic people and ADHDers, there may be an increased risk of something called PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. It's like PMS, but more serious. It can cause anxiety, depression, rage, and then also some physical symptoms. I personally become very mentally foggy. I get very tired, and I have a lot more sensory sensitivities at this time of the month. My vision stuff that I was describing before gets way worse. I just feel, I would say, about 10 times more autistic. Obviously, being autistic is not inherently a bad thing. Like, I feel like I have 10 times more of the negative traits and the more difficult sides of being autistic, and it varies from month to month how much it affects me, which can be difficult because you don't always know how bad it's going to be, and you don't always know exactly which day it's going to fall on either, which can be frustrating when you're like kind of trying to plan your life and your life doesn't just stop because you're feeling 10 times 10 times more negative autism traits than you usually do. But according to the charity Mind, PMDD can also be linked to trauma as well. In general, I think it's wonderful that so many more people are exploring the fact that they could be neurodivergent, that we're discussing this more. At the very least, even if it turns out you are neurotypical, I just don't see what the harm is in exploring more, because I feel like at the very least you're going to come away with more understanding of neurodivergence, and it may be that about 20% of people are neurodivergent. So I think that's good knowledge and information to have. I love this quote from Judy Singer: "You cannot have neurodiverse as an adjective to describe anything else except the whole world." She draws a parallel with biodiversity, which is not used for a particular type of plant or animal, but the overall variety of every living creature. It's the property of the whole biosphere. It would be wonderful to live in a world that truly acknowledges and also values neurodiversity. If you missed last week's video, I do think it's kind of relevant. I discussed the ethics, I suppose, of kind of armchair diagnosing celebrities such as Taylor Swift, Beyonce, Eminem. Do not shout at me about Eminem. I talk about Eminem later on in the video. There were people getting so mad at me in the comments, but they had not watched the full video. Don't get mad at me about Eminem. And if you would like more content from me, you are welcome to join me over on Patreon. The lowest tier is $4 a month. You'll get 2 exclusive videos every month, and you can also access the Discord server. I have even more stuff over on the Patreon. On the higher tiers, me and my husband do a podcast. Recently, we've done 2 episodes that was so fun about idioms and trying to decode what different idioms mean. So from an autistic and neurotypical perspective, it just ended up being really funny, and it seems like people have really enjoyed that episode. If you do join, avoid paying on the iOS app if you can, because it will try and charge you more money, which will go to Apple. Not to me, not to the channel. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, you can check out Ground News using the QR code on screen or clicking the link in the description, ground.news/nowwhat, and you can get 50% off their Vantage plan if you sign up through the link. I'll see you in my next video very soon. Bye.